So I really felt strongly that we needed to have some kind of program about Katharine Lee Bates as part of our sesquicentennial. And so that's what I'm offering here today. As you can see, I've got our statue that's out in front of the Pioneers Museum featured in the first slide, and it will be a central focus in some ways of this presentation. She is our primary view in a literal sense of Katharine Lee Bates, that statue is. We see it often. It's not necessarily a perfect likeness, of course, there's always artistic license. And so you'll see that what Katharine looked like from several photographs and representations in this PowerPoint. I want you also to notice the years of her lifespan. I tend to teach my Colorado history students to remember years ending in 9 because it's one way they can remember the years of the 3 major gold rushes of the history that we learned. So they are really good at remembering 49 for California for an obvious reason. So once I've taught them that Colorado's is 59, they can remember that. And so Katharine Lee Bates is born in Massachusetts in the year of the Colorado Gold Rush. And as you probably all can tell, died in the year of the great stock market crash. So it's really remarkable anytime you're focusing on a period of history or a person's lifetime to think about that. It also points up to us that she, by our standards today, was relatively young when she died. We don't want people dying at 70. But on the other hand, it was different then, and she was not as happy as she might have been by that age too. But it's memorable. It's memorable Colorado history that she was born even in Massachusetts in 59. And it's memorable of how the nation changed between then and the Great Depression. This statue very appropriately is viewing the peak, and that's going to be a part of this talk, definitely, looking at the symbolism of that and how important it is then once you've built a statue facing the peak to look at the peak to make sure you don't block the view of the peak. That's one of the local controversies some of you will probably remember, I definitely do, that will come up in this discussion. Notice that she's really, though, viewing the peak, but that is not where her lyrical view is. In other words, when she wrote the poem that became the lyrics to America the Beautiful, she was really viewing everything from the top of the peak, not from down on the ground. And the top of the peak is where you see many purple mountain majesties, many golden waves of grain, especially in those days when agriculture was different and frankly, air quality was different. But her view was from the top. And she wrote that from the top. And that becomes important when you compare different versions of what inspired her and when she wrote the lyrics, because she did not write the lyrics from just looking out a window at the peak. Also, the statue, I think, has an appropriately dignified quality, holding her head high. It is appropriately gendered. It's important that she look as she did, like a woman of her times. And as some of you know, her gender or her determination or inclinations about her gender are important to her story. And she does look introspective and serious. I think she had lots of fun in life, but she also, I think, knew she had to maintain a certain image. She is a fully employed academic woman all of her adult life. And that means that she was conscious of all of the expectations that she faced. Notice she's too, our statue is appropriately enjoying a respite in a garden, which Katharine Lee Bates would certainly like. And she's representing to residents and visitors that Colorado Springs and Colorado and Pikes Peak and women are all central to America's virtues and values. And let's see if I can get my slide to move here. There we go. So from the backside, the statue, of course, dwarfs in comparison to modern buildings. But you can see already what the problem was. If you weren't around in 2003 or thereabouts to hear the dispute, then you don't necessarily know what we're talking about until you look at the difference. She and the museum had a view of Pike's Peak, and reconstruction, rehabilitation, moving things meant that possibly without there being any height restrictions, there would be a loss of that total view. So originally in the planning of all this newer architecture, there was not an intent that was any consistent intent to protect that view for the museum until it became a political controversy. And the controversy in discussions in the political spectrum of Colorado Springs tended not to focus on the statue, not to say we've got to save that view for the statue, but all of us who talked about it at the time tended to say, you can't cut off the view of Pike's Peak from the Katharine Lee Bates statue that's put there to look at it. But the way you campaigned for the issue was to say you wouldn't want to cut it off from the Pioneers Museum, of course. I have some recommendations for good reading here. And there is one good biography of Katharine Lee Bates that is modern and scholarly. It also happens to be somewhat creative, and that is From Sea to Shining Sea by Melinda Ponder. I do recommend it. It is easy to obtain, but you might best just go through Amazon. Ponder is herself a former Wellesley faculty member, as Katharine Lee Bates was, and scholar there, and a professor emeritus of another college in Massachusetts. So really came in touch with the viewpoints and the spirit of Katharine Lee Bates, and wrote a biography that really has a creative quality. In some ways, I hesitate when I see it because I'm used to book reviewing and book editing at the scholarly end of things. We tend to be skeptical of being a little more creative, a little more literary, but my goodness, it does make better reading. And so she definitely is. And I think that any license that she takes with Bates' life and experiences is historically and literarily based, so that it's all plausible. It's all something that it's very legitimate to think that fits the life of Katharine Lee Bates. So I would recommend reading that. It is fun to read. Another sort of publication that I wanted to mention to you is that the post office has America the Beautiful stamps, and went to some trouble to make sure that they were tied in every way possible to the lyrics of the song. So since that meant 5 categories of stamps in these rows, they have spacious skies pictures, they have waves of grain pictures, mountain majesties pictures, fruited plain pictures, and sea to shining sea pictures. So another thing you might get from Amazon, because it seems to be one of the handiest places, would be that. I'm thinking of getting one framed. I just think it's so pretty. As far as keeping relics in town, we've been on again, off again. Fortunately, the statue in its view. We still have America the Beautiful Park, but Katharine Lee Bates Elementary School fell. And so it's, like I say, a little on again, off again, which is normal for a town that both values its history, but also values its growth. There she is. So this is the author of America the Beautiful. Can't you tell? She saw it immediately. This is Katie. And Katie Bates was born in 1859, as we said, in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Already here, I want you to be thinking about the kind of cultural, social background she's coming from, the values of her family, the attitudes toward women. The attitudes will surprise you perhaps in some ways. Her father might have had a much greater influence on her had he not died a few weeks after she was born. She's the baby of the family. But he was the congregational minister of Falmouth, Massachusetts. So on the one hand, in that time period, that would probably mean he was reform-minded in terms of being an abolitionist against slavery, for example. But he probably also would have had some very severe, by most modern standards, severe values of someone with strong Puritan background. And although I would say that Katie has those values too, what she gets much more of by being raised by her mother and a literary aunt is an appreciation of women's education, of how driven she will become in that. It turns out that the literary aunt and her mother, so both the women influencing Katie, attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, established by Mary Lyon as one of the half a dozen premier earliest institutions for giving a semblance of a college education to women. They call them female seminaries because that helped sell. One of them was Troy Female Seminary, and I always remember how Emma Willard, the founder of that, had to convince the legislature in order to fund her school that they would be making better mothers out of these young women, because after all, shouldn't a young woman who's going to be the mother of America's young men be good at raising good citizens, know enough to do that? So there was a selling of this women's education goal by a little finagling around people's prejudices, but women who really believed in it, like Katie's mother and her aunt, and Katie, because she goes to Mount Holyoke, are going to really firmly believe in this cause, maybe more than anything else she believes in. So as much of a reformer and passionate follower of causes that, or leader of them, that she will be, I would say that Katie is going to especially feel that her education and her continuing role in being an educator at an all-women's college, Wellesley, is more important than perhaps getting married, perhaps having your own family, and many other things. And I like these two pictures, and they just, one of the suggested ways to display them was this one, and I like it. She ends up living in the family home in Falmouth, wonderful old New England house, sold a few years ago, historic site. And here she is, obviously at a gray-haired stage, but in her wonderful academic gowns, right? And posing in her study. It looks a little bit like mine behind me. I have piles too. Giving us a strong feeling of her property ownership, even though it's through family, of her salary, of her workaday world, of her belief in higher education, all the things that she might think would be threatened were she to take a more traditional female role. In other words, get married. Oops. Oh. And this is another person who is very relevant to the question of whether Katie would or did get married. Many of you might realize that Katharine Lee Bates in modern times is often analyzed as a lesbian or some stage of that, and that she is often seen as having had what amounted to a same-sex marriage of sorts, not a legal marriage, but of living together devotedly and lovingly with her dearest friend and fellow academic woman from Wellesley, Catherine Coman. 25 years living together. Catherine died in 1915, and remember that Katie doesn't die until 1929. Catherine suffered from cancer in those last several years, and Katie was her nurse at home. And this poem, Catherine Lee Bates wrote in 1922. I'm just moving the little column that gives me your names and your pictures when they show, so I can read you the poem. My love, if you could come once more from your high place, I would not question you for heavenly lore, but silent take the comfort of your face. I would not ask you if those golden spheres in love rejoice, if only our stained star hath sin and tears, but fill my famished hearing with your voice. One touch of you were worth 1,000 creeds. My wound is numb. Through toil-pressed day, but all night long it bleeds, in aching dreams, and still you cannot come. There's obviously a very deep love here, and there are many different ways, many different contexts to put it in for women of that time. I'm going to try to share all of the main ones with you. I don't intend for you to believe any one of them in particular, and I don't have any particular agenda about them. But I do think this is obviously a very, very deep love. And I think that many women of that time, particularly if they were isolated from the rest of society, workaday or even women's work society, into an academic world, they would not be thinking so much of ever committing themselves to relationships that took them out of their academic world or out of their professional world or out of their financial independence. And therefore, they would have relationships with each other, which obviously could be very, very deep, regardless of how we categorize them today. So there is a was she or wasn't she about Katharine Lee Bates, and I'm sure some of you knew that already. It's something you can see anytime you look her up on the web. And so I wanted to share some examples and information with you. Two examples here, the ones where I highlighted in yellow, are modern things I just picked off the web today. One author is describing Katharine Lee Bates as a gay feminist badass from Massachusetts who wrote America the Beautiful. Not my favorite choice of words, but once in a while when it's applied just right, it's kind of fun. I can imagine people feeling encouraged by that description who identify with that and want to have historical figures they can identify with. It's meant to be a little sharp, and it is. Here's a little more in historical and social context from another man. This man is a professor of politics, so he's very politically oriented. Today, within historical context is what I'm saying this one has more of. Bates, you see, was a Christian socialist. Now that, by the way, is labeling her of something that, while she might have been comfortable in such organizations later in life, she did not walk around with that label on her chest. An ally of labor unions, she does become that. An advocate for immigrants, yes. A feminist, again, a term we use that was coming into usage, but I'm not sure she would have labeled herself that. An ardent foe of imperialism, yes. And a lesbian. And again, I don't think she would have labeled herself that unless she were doing so in a very private situation. But going on, a well-respected poet and professor of English at Wellesley College, Bates was part of a progressive reform circles in Boston area concerned about labor rights, urban slums, and women's suffrage. Absolutely. And so what this gentleman is saying is when you put her in historical context about all of her opinions and values about social reform, as well as thinking about her being a woman who has never married, who was raised by women, although he doesn't necessarily realize that, who was all women's schooling, and so on, it seems possible that she either was a lesbian or would have even accepted the label had it been in more common usage then. But we don't know of her ever accepting such a label or pronouncing herself that way in anything. All we can do is analyze her writing and her lifestyle for clues to perhaps the feelings of relationships that appear to be lesbian or at least romantic with other women. I wanted to make sure as a note to myself, to you, to say that she had several young men pining after her, Katie did, when she was a student and when she was a young woman professor. In one case, when she starts traveling and she's writing in her journals, this fellow is so pursuing of her and so languishing without her and so desperate for her that she's really worried about him. She becomes physically ill, not as though she's repelled by him, but as though the stress of his affection for her is overwhelming. And then when she's in England, there's an example where she's writing to her mother, and she's always writing in journals too. And she describes this young man admiringly. He's actually 6 years younger than she. She carefully underlines his name and things like that. But then when she writes about him to her mother, without saying that she's attracted to him or he to her, but she's just describing him, she then leaps to make sure her mother understands she has absolutely no plans to leave Wellesley. So remember, we're talking about a time when it was much, much, much more absolute than it is now, that any woman getting married would leave her career and turn homemaking into her career. That was a given. And here's one where we have a quote from Bates herself. In 1910, a colleague was writing, half jokingly, a man, about free flying spinsters as the fringe on the garment of life. Like there's population of them just fringing out there. And Bates's reply was, I always thought the fringe had the best of it. I don't think I mind not being woven in. So there's a nonconformist in there, right? And someone who's, we could start to see if just the right things had been said to her just the right way, we might have found out a little bit more than we do know for sure about her private life. There's this construct called a Boston marriage, and I know some of you've read about this. I really want to get across a couple of historical context pieces to this. Here's a definition I've pieced together from a lot of them that are on the web. A long-term loving relationship between two women is often what you'll find, that might or might not include romantic or sexual intimacy. Now, this is me adding here. Historically, this was more common where marriageable men occurred in reduced numbers, such as New England after the Civil War, and where such women could best afford housing by sharing expenses. So I wanted to make that really clear. First of all, they are sharing expenses, and so they can live in a nicer house together. But this absence of men is so seldom mentioned in all of these discussions of Boston marriage. And the Civil War was so devastating to New England towns. Whole towns of young men went to serve in the war. Whole neighborhoods, whole families, and were killed or maimed or emotionally and psychologically distressed. Or another thing was, you didn't stay at home in New England after the Civil War when the best places to escape or make something new of your life was to go west. This is one of the reasons, one of the key reasons why there's such a phenomenon as mail order brides, because there were all these old maids living in New England and all of these unmarried men who'd moved west. And I'll give you one little example of this. If you've ever read or seen the dramatization of the story Sarah Plain and Tall. And Sarah Plain and Tall is a young woman from Maine who becomes a mail order bride to Nebraska. Before she leaves Maine, you see her in the lifestyle she's had, which is living with a group of eccentric maiden aunts, all these unmarried women together, for the reason that I just gave you. Other things to consider with Boston marriages. If you're interested in this, I'm giving you another reading suggestion. Go to this site of the Longfellow House, Washington headquarters, National Historic Site, and it will give you an example of Boston marriages coming out of literature, of all things, for Katharine Lee Bates. I don't see anyone in her day more knowledgeable about American and British literature. And Longfellow wrote about these women who became extra affectionate toward each other, not just living together as sisters or friends or whatever, but extra romantic and affectionate, as though that was a fad because it was encouraged of young women at the time. The other thing to mention here is when she says, I don't intend to leave Wellesley, that could mean two things. That can mean I don't want to get married because marriage and a man will expect me to leave my career. It can also mean I will literally be fired. I will literally lose my employment. I don't know if that was true in her situation in any contractual way that she knew in advance, but it was extremely common, and especially continues well into the 20th century because of the Great Depression, where even state governments would not allow women to be hired if men could be hired because men were supposed to be the breadwinners. So there's so many elements that would explain this new arrangement or this perpetual arrangement in her life. I think it could be any or all of the above, and all of them are very understandable. Well, now we get her to Colorado Springs. So it's a summer school she comes to teach, put on by Colorado College. And I often wish I could go back in time. I'd love to know Katharine Lee Bates. My goodness, I'd love to go back in time and go to a summer school where I get to be taught by Katharine Lee Bates, Hamlin Garland, the great writer about life and the plains, and Woodrow Wilson for a little bit of philosophy. Amazing. When she comes here to teach in that summer school, she is remarking a lot in her journals about how everyone entertains her and welcomes her and treats her as someone who needs to see everything and do everything. She loves the Palmers, but she loves a lot of people. And one of the things she comments on is that they seem to be trying to think of every way they possibly can to entertain her. She including providing young male escorts. So when she needs an accompanier at an event or someone to take her on a tour or whatever, they seem to be choosing young men, which is an interesting thing. Not surprising, I guess. I remember one of them is named Noyes, N-O-Y-E-S, in case any of you are connected to that name in Colorado Springs. When she goes up to Pike's Peak, and this is 1893, so absolutely 1893 is when she's out here. It's when she goes up the peak. It's when she thinks up the first stanzas of the song. And it's just after she's come through Chicago, where her dear friend Katharine has taken her on a tour of the World's Columbian Exposition, the so-called White City of Chicago, where she sees all of those amazing things from around the world and all of those new modern inventions. She would have seen also some downsides from the point of view of the social reformer. And then she comes here. And then the big treat is to go to the top of Pike's Peak. Nobody thinks, and then she'll write a poem about it. No, she's going up the peak. They actually set aside a covered wagon, a prairie schooner kind of wagon, and painted Pike's Peak or bust on it for her and her friends, the other people visiting, to go to the top. And then it overturned. And so the rest of the trip, she rode a mule to get to the top after a long delay. And one of my favorite little thoughts she has when she's looking at the scenery up there is that she feels sorry for Zebulon Pike, that young lieutenant who never made it to the top. There are some wildly mistaken accounts of what inspired this song, and my favorite one of the accounts is from her niece, Dorothy Burgess. So there's another book. It's hard to find. I've only found it in original copies. So you need to be willing to spend a little bit if you want to get a rare copy. But niece Dorothy Burgess, and of course on the left, there's Katharine for you, wrote down some of these weird accounts people came up with of how she wrote the song. And this one that niece Dorothy thinks is the wildest is a radio commentator said that Katharine Lee Bates was a woman athlete at the time. And she was in a walking contest where everyone was in a race to see who could get to the top first. So as the first woman athlete to walk to the top of Pike's Peak, she was so thrilled to win that she wrote the poem. That's not true. Also, there are inaccurate versions in our own Gazette Telegraph, which are really interesting. There's a very wonderful accurate version that I'm going to show you second, but this is the inaccurate version that came first. And by the way, if you don't know how to find these wonderful things, there is this gift from God called the Pikes Peak News Finder that the Pikes Peak Library District runs online. And you can look up and ask them to help you retrieve articles from the whole history of the Gazette and many, many, many other documents. So in 1924, this article actually says that some friends of Mrs. Bates, so first of all, she's not Mrs. Bates, and I don't think that's a euphemism. I think it's an assumption. Supposedly the reporter asks some friends of hers who tell him the story of how she wrote the song, and the story comes out that she wrote it in 1911 when she was, this isn't a knot, when she's staying in the Antlers Hotel, not visiting then, and she's looking out her west window of her hotel room, not, at the peak from the ground and writing the song. No. Okay. She is, on the contrary, this is the article you want. So if you would like to see the article and keep a copy of it that really tells the story and does it from her, she wrote it. It is by Katharine Lee Bates. Come on, Katharine, over here. There she is, right up there, right? See her at the top. My mouse pad's not having, there you go. 1928, she wrote this. She is recalling back to the trip. This is 1928 again. Notice that the Pikes Peak Newsfinder even puts the dates on things for you. And as she recalls it, she says it's her impression that she wrote the entire 4 stanzas of the song that evening in 1893 after the trip up the peak, penciled them in her notebook that she still has. So she tells you right there herself what she did, when she did it, where she did it. And then she tells you that she found the verses disheartening. That's Katharine. All right, so then there's a fight for her right to her view. And there always is, right? Her viewpoint, her view of what a marriage is, her view of life. And in this case, I'm not going to be saying her view upon her death in the cemetery, but I'm going to say on her view here. So Falmouth, Massachusetts has this view, right? They have her buried in the family plot in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and obviously being well recognized there. Her house, as I mentioned, there sold recently for a lot of money as a wonderful historic site. But her view that I want to preserve is what she was talking about in that article. And we want it to be preserved authentically and as she saw it. So we're not doing too much damage. Who knows what global warming will do, but we're not doing too much damage to the top of the peak. So we have that view. But the view down from it, of course, is very different from what she would have seen. partly because agriculture has changed. There aren't as many amber waves of grain that you would see if you could see to Kansas, for example. And there isn't as much clarity of vision because of the air quality. But we still have the top of the peak. And we also had our statue looking up at it. But in 2003, there was quite a controversy about that, as I mentioned before, with the construction of new courthouse space and the belief that we just have such a crowded downtown, you need to build higher. No, you need to keep height restrictions on things, and that became controversial. The whole battle even went to the point of petitions to remove particular elected officials. And it's 2003, which is recent enough that the politicians involved in all of this are still familiar people. They're still in office or still just very familiar to all of us. So if you wanted to know who was on what side, if you weren't around or if you don't remember, you can go find that out still in the newspaper. But notice that the petition drive was part of it. And there were two types of petitions, one against some officials, but one was petitions to simply preserve the Pioneers Museum's view, to not have any of that architecture cut off our view from the Pioneers Museum. Because like I said, it's a little iffier to say it so the statue can see it, but the view from the Pioneers Museum. And I remember signing one of those petitions, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if someone in our audience right now or someone else that you all know was standing out there with petitions right next to her statue, getting us to sign them. And we won. So there she is again. She still gets to sit there and look at that magnificent peak. That's not how she wrote it, remember. She wrote it from the top looking down, or at least she dreamed it up, and then came down and went to her hotel and again envisioned what she saw from the top. And that's what the lyrics talk about, is what you see from the top, except you could call it one of the Purple Mountain Majesties, but you're not really looking at it when you're up there. And so we have her staring at it very intently. I think it's safe in all the different developments that we have in downtown Colorado Springs. So our views of Bates, all those things I said originally, I think it's appropriate that we own her. We own part of her. We own a place that is perhaps a better testimonial to her than her own grave. Although I think she would probably want all of the educational contribution she made. She was a huge, prolific writer. And so again, just look for books and articles by Katharine Lee Bates. And I've read quite a few now. Because my second field was American and British literature, I love watching her. She traveled all through England. And so you learn about Shakespeare or Chaucer largely from not only her interpretation of the writing, but her being on the spots that are spoken of in those classics. And she was cerebral, but she wrote for a common audience. So she wrote children's books, she wrote Christmas stories, she wrote animal stories, she wrote adult legends for children. Her wonderful pet was a collie. She wrote the story of her collie dog, and that collie looked a lot like Lassie, I think, from one picture I saw. So her views are wonderful to read, as well as our scenic views that we associate with her. I think she never lost her dignity, and although some of those words like badass make me a little uncomfortable just because they're not the most dignified words, I think that if she were able to if she is, if you want to be ethereal about it, if she is listening, if she is watching, as we discuss her in all these situations, I think that she would be honest about her lifestyle, whatever it was, and she would not go on a defensive if it were something that somebody disapproved of. She was introspective, but she was not afraid. In fact, if she were afraid of anything from what I've read so far, I would say it's that element where somehow someone would expect her to give up her career or take it away from her, because there were those outside forces threatening women, and still are sometimes. She would still like a garden. And I think she appropriately represents two people who come here, that there's something special about Colorado Springs that would occasion a poet, even though it's our mountain, but it is our mountain. Right? There's obviously something very special about Pike's Peak. And we've been pretty good. We haven't destroyed it, right? We now have the way to get back up there again. And I think most of the activity of building the Summit House, or things like making sure the rules and regulations about racing on the peak, everything we can, we try to think of ways to make sure we're preservationist minded. And that women are all central to America's virtues and values. She was, even if we never know for sure, which we might not, what her sexual preference was, her preference was women. Her preference of human beings. She admired men for so many things they'd achieved, but women had been the underdogs. Women had been the ones who'd been restricted from those things. So more than even immigrants, for example, women immigrants particularly needed support. It was her job in life to uplift her own gender and to admire it and to see what was good about it. And so I think she's someone we can all admire and remember, and a very important part of our sesquicentennial. Thank you for letting me share her with you today.